problem of evil has plagued people's confidence in the existence of God for thousands of years. Why? People wonder, if God is all-powerful and all-loving, why doesn't he stop all of the evil and suffering in the world from occurring? Why do we have so many starving children in the world? Why do people suffer from chronic pain? Why is there death and destruction? This is perhaps the #1 argument for atheism's truth claim that there is no God. The answer the atheist gives to this question is that the reason why God doesn't stop evil and suffering from occurring is that there is no God to intervene. Evil and suffering unabated is exactly what one would expect if there is no God. Thus, atheism is more probably true than false. There are a couple of different versions of this argument that atheist philosophers defend. They are 1. The logical version, and 2. The evidential version. The first of the two argues that God and evil, or suffering, are logically incompatible. They're like the irresistible force and the immovable object. If one exists, then the other cannot. If you establish the existence of the one, you disprove the existence of the other. The evidential version, by contrast, is a more modest approach. It argues that even if God and evil are logically compatible, nevertheless, evil renders God's existence unlikely. This is why this version of the argument is sometimes called the probabilistic version of the problem of evil. In this video, I will address the logical version and address the evidential version, in a separate video. The first version of the argument is most commonly associated with the Greek philosopher Epicurus, who lived a couple of hundred years before Christ. The forms of the syllogisms that the argument from evil, the logical version, takes are varied, and some are kind of lengthy, some being 7 or 8 premises long. For the sake of simplicity, and for the sake of preventing this video from being longer than it needs to be, I'll condense it into its most easy-to-remember form. 1. If God is all-powerful, he can create any world he wants. 2. If God is all-good, he would prefer to create a world without evil and suffering. 3. Therefore, God both can and wants to create a world without evil and suffering. 4. But evil and suffering exists. 5. Therefore, God either is not all-powerful, not all-loving, or both. This is the simplest version of the argument I could formulate, and to the atheist's credit, it's intuitively powerful. However, given that I'm not an atheist, you know that I find this argument to be fallacious. Let's look at the argument's premises and see why they fail. Remember, any argument must have all of the premises be true in order for the conclusion to be reached. If even one of the premises is false, then the argument is not a sound argument. Moreover, in the case of the logical version of the problem of evil, all of the premises have to be necessarily true. If it's even possible that they're not true, then the logical version collapses. Let's examine premise 1. Is it necessarily true? I'm skeptical that it is. How do we know that God is able, that he can, create any kind of world that he desires? I would suggest that it is possible that 1. God desires a world of creatures endowed with libertarian free will, and 2. That it is possible that it is infeasible for God to actualize such a world and ensure that no free creature ever abuses his freedom to introduce evil and suffering into the world. Before we proceed, it is important that we define what we mean by the term omnipotence. By omnipotence, we do not mean that God can do literally anything. We do not mean that God can create square circles, one-ended sticks, or rocks too heavy for him to lift. By omnipotence, I mean the ability to do anything logically possible. Put another way, God can actualize any state of affairs that isn't incoherent or violates the laws of logic, such as non-contradiction, excluded middle, or identity. Anything that's logically impossible, God cannot do. On the other hand, if it's logically possible, then God can do it. God can create everything out of nothing, make the blind see, the deaf hear, raise the dead, make axe heads float in water, part the Red Sea, cause a donkey to be able to speak, etc. As C.S. Lewis wrote, quote, "His omnipotence means power to do all that is intrinsically possible, not to do the intrinsically impossible. You may attribute miracles to him, but not nonsense. This is no limit to his power. Meaningless combinations of words do not suddenly acquire meaning simply because we prefix to them the two other words God can. It remains true that all things are possible with God. The intrinsic impossibilities are not things, but non-entities. It is no more possible for God than for the weakest of his creatures to carry out both of two mutually exclusive alternatives, not because his power meets an obstacle, but because nonsense remains nonsense even when we talk it about God." End quote. This is the definition of omnipotence that is accepted by the majority of contemporary theologians and Christian philosophers. It is possible that in any world of free creatures God could actualize, there would be at least some people who abuse their free will and go wrong. In this case, premise 1 is not necessarily true. It may be the case that God cannot create any world he wants, because in any feasible world, there are people who abuse their God-given free will and cause suffering to other creatures. Any world God could actualize with free creatures in them, every single one of those feasible worlds would have at least some people abuse their free will and cause evil and suffering to other creatures. God cannot force someone to do something freely. If they do it freely, they're not forced. If they're forced to do it, then they do not do what they're doing freely. Being omnipotent, God can either give men free will and let them choose how they please, or he can causally determine them to always do right, but he cannot do both. It is not necessarily true that God can create a world without evil and suffering if human beings have free will. Now, if the atheist wants to respond that he thinks the correct definition of omnipotence is being able to do literally anything, even the logically impossible, and therefore God could create a world of free creatures where no one causes suffering, then the logical problem of evil vanishes. Why? Because if God is able to bring about logically incoherent states of affairs, then he can bring it about that both he and evil coexist, even though, according to the atheist, they logically cancel each other out. So I think it would behoove the atheist to stick to the definition of omnipotence that most contemporary theologians accept. At this point, the atheist may object that while it's possible that God is unable to create a world of free creatures in which no one ever freely chooses to cause suffering to another individual, nevertheless, why would God care so much about free will anyway? Since God could ensure that no one ever does evil by forcing people to choose right instead of wrong, why not create that kind of world? Why not create a world in which God forces everyone to do the right thing and to prevent them from ever doing the wrong thing, sort of like a puppet world? I think there are a couple of plausible reasons why God would prefer a world of free will, even if that entails suffering, to a world with no free will and no suffering. Love, in order to be genuine, must be freely given. Dr. Tim Stratton of Free Thinking Ministries gives a very helpful illustration from pop culture that helps get this point across. He writes, quote, "Many think that love Harley Quinn has for the Joker is the epitome of love. This relationship was portrayed in the recent movie Suicide Squad. Harley Quinn demonstrates that she lives for the Joker. She is willing to die for the Joker, and she is willing to kill for the Joker. Her life revolves around the Joker, and she is devoted to following him no matter the costs. Although it has been said that Harley Quinn and the Joker are a great example of true love, I think this relationship is the farthest thing from it. I contend that this relationship is not true love at all. Rather, it is the epitome of evil. You see, according to the Suicide Squad movie, the Joker kidnapped and brainwashed Harley against her will. The Joker forced himself upon her and causally determined her to be unable to resist him. Left to Harley's own devices, she would always reject the Joker if given a choice, but the Joker took any ability away from her to choose otherwise. She has been manipulated, she has suffered psychological trauma, and she has been raped against her will, even though the Joker has forced her to think and act in accord with his will. You see, the Joker has no idea what it truly means to be loved. All he has is a kidnapped woman who has no choice but to follow him. She literally has no ability to do otherwise. Now, I'm sure the Joker would have preferred it if Harley Quinn would have freely chosen to love and follow him, as that would have brought him more glory. But since she would not freely choose to be with the Joker, he had to force himself upon her against her will. The Joker simply became irresistible, as she had her ability to resist stolen from her. Now she has no ability but to follow him and utter the words, "I love Mr. J." End quote. An example I often like to give involves a futuristic society in which robots look, think, and act 100% identically to human beings. Let's say you go down to Robo Depot to buy yourself a wife. You buy this android that looks as beautiful as a supermodel. Based on her looks, you already know she's got the attractiveness quality. But what of her character? The manual she comes with tells you that you can program her personality any way you desire. So you program her to always do what you want, to always put your needs above hers, and to always laugh at your jokes, etc. You program her to never leave you for another man. You program her to say, "I love you" 20 times a day. You program her to never bother you while watching football. In fact, you program her to be just as into football as you are. You program her to be the perfect wife. Question: would any of this be meaningful to you? Would you feel loved? No. You would clearly recognize that her love for you is artificial. Every act of kindness, every display of affection, and every "I love you" was your doing, not hers. You causally determined her to do these things for you. They did not originate with her. All of her acts of love and selflessness would be empty gestures because you caused her to do them. You caused her to do them. She didn't, you did. And she had no ability, no capability whatsoever of doing differently. Similarly, if God causally determined everyone to love him, praise and worship him 24/7, never disobey him, to always do good deeds instead of evil actions, our actions would be devoid of meaningfulness. The only reason we would praise him is that he programmed us to praise him. The only reason we would abstain from sin is that he programmed us to abstain from it. It would be the same for our love for one another. If God causally determines a man to love his wife, I just don't see how that would be any more meaningful than when a little girl causes a Ken doll to show love to a Barbie doll. Let's go on to look at premise 2 in the logical version of the problem of evil. If God is all good, then he would prefer to create a world where no evil or suffering exists. It seems like this premise is true, doesn't it? God doesn't want a world where people kill, rape, and maim each other, right? What good God would? In fact, if God did want a world where people kill, rape, and maim each other, why did he forbid so many of these actions? It seems like God does prefer a world where no evil or suffering exists. That's why in the Bible we find commands not to murder, in Exodus chapter 20, verse 13, to not commit adultery, Exodus chapter 20, verse 14, to not steal, Exodus chapter 20, verse 15, etc. If he didn't desire us to follow these commands, he wouldn't have given them. However, although God would like a world where no one kills, commits adultery, or steals, it's possible that God has overriding reasons which might make him prefer a world more like ours. I already gave one of those reasons, namely that God wanted a world where it was possible for us to genuinely love him and each other. In order to create a world where genuine love exists, God may have to put up with a world in which hatred exists. It's possible that God had no choice but to create a world with suffering if true love were to be possible. In order to create a world where genuine love exists, God may have to put up with a world in which hatred exists. Moreover, it is possible that God has other morally sufficient reasons for permitting all of these evils in the world that we see. It's possible that God knows that if he permits a certain instance of suffering, a greater good would come out of it. We all know cases where we ourselves permit suffering in order to bring about a greater good. Just think of the first time your parents took you to the doctor to get a vaccine. The injection hurt and you probably cried, yet clearly your parents had a good reason for allowing you to suffer, i.e., so that you wouldn't contract a serious disease. God may allow suffering X at T1, knowing that greater good Y would come about at T5. So although God may find a world without suffering more attractive than one with suffering, it's possible that he would prefer to actualize a world with suffering, given the aforementioned. So it's possible that premise 2 is not necessarily true. Hence, since neither of the two premises are necessarily true, the logical version of the problem of evil and suffering collapses. God and evil, or suffering, are logically compatible. For the logical version of the problem of evil to succeed, the atheist shoulders an enormous burden of proof. He has to show that libertarian free will is impossible, or he has to show that true love can exist even in the absence of libertarian free will, thus removing incentive for God to create a world of libertarianly free creatures, or he has to show that a world of free creatures in which every individual always did good and never ever did anything wrong was a feasible world for God to create. It was a possible world that God could have actualized. If he does any or all of these, then premises 1 and 2 would be substantiated and the logical version would succeed. The logical version of the problem of evil, while widely propounded by non-philosophers, people on the internet, Reddit atheists, Twitter atheists, Facebook atheists, although it's widely propounded by non-philosophers, philosophers who are atheists don't use this version of the argument. They use the evidential version of the argument that I plan on addressing in a separate video. As the well-known atheist philosopher Paul Draper says, quote, "Logical arguments from evil are a dying breed. Even an omnipotent and omniscient being might be forced to allow evil for the sake of obtaining some important good," end quote. And as Christian philosopher Peter Van Inwagen put it, quote, "It used to be widely held that evil was incompatible with the existence of God, that no possible world contained both God and evil. So far as I am able to tell, this thesis is no longer defended," end quote. But what about natural evil? Most of what I said in regards to the logical version's first premise rested on the free will defense, famously associated with the Christian philosopher Alvin Plantinga, who defended it in his book God, Freedom, and Evil. Although I think the free will defense is a powerful response to the problem of moral evil, critics of the argument say that it doesn't go far enough. It doesn't answer why God allows natural evil. Even if, the critic says, we grant that God could not actualize a world where free will creatures always treat each other with respect, and ergo do not cause suffering to each other, nevertheless, it certainly seems feasible that God could actualize a world where natural disasters like tornadoes, floods, hurricanes, pandemics, etc. do not occur. So even though the free will defense might show that God's hands were tied, so to speak, with regards to moral evil, certainly God's hands should not be so tied when it comes to natural evil. Neil deGrasse Tyson is a world-renowned astrophysicist and science popularizer. However, he also spends much of his time popularizing an argument against the Christian view of God. Tyson often makes claims such as the following.
The description of God that I've heard holds God to be all-powerful, very typical, and all good. And then I look around and I see a tsunami that killed 250,000 people in Indonesia, an earthquake that killed 250,000 people in Haiti, and I see earthquakes and tornadoes and disease, childhood leukemia, and I see all of this and I say, I do not see evidence of both of those being true simultaneously. If there is a God, the God is either not all-powerful or not all good.
To once again draw on the work of Dr. Tim Stratton, with regards to natural evil, this may also serve a good purpose, a purpose that God actually could not achieve without the suffering natural evil, and evil in general, helps to achieve. Stratton gives what he calls the 3 circles model in response to the problem of evil. This, he says, deals with all the problems of evil, quote unquote. Stratton gives the outline of his proposal as follows. A. Suffering, whether it be moral evil, natural evil, or seemingly gratuitous evil, points us to the way things ought to be. We learn from suffering and evil that it ought not be. B. The way things ought to be is an eternal love relationship with God and all people in a perfect state of affairs. This is what we refer to as heaven. C. Libertarian freedom is necessarily required for true love. D. Finite creatures who possess libertarian freedom learn over time. E. Supernatural zaps of knowledge do not work. Most created beings must attain experiential knowledge. F. Adam, Eve, Satan, and a third of all the angels took suffering-free states of affairs for granted and freely chose to wreck it. G. You and I have experienced evil, suffering, and affliction, and we are made aware of so much more. Because of our experiences with evil and suffering, you and I will not take suffering-free states of affairs for granted, because we have genuinely learned from our experiences. H. Because you and I have learned how stupid evil is, although we possess the same ability to wreck a perfect state of affairs, God created a world in which He knew that we will always freely choose to love God and all people exactly as God intends us to for eternity. That is to say, although we could wreck it, as Adam and Eve did, God knows that we never would or will sin into the infinite future after experiencing limited amounts of evil on earth. J.I. Some creatures have freely chosen not to learn from evil. They will be eternally separated from those of us who have. A and B seem intuitively obvious. Just a moment's reflection on what's wrong in your life shows you that you believe it ought not to be this way. You should be happy. You should be devoid of physical, mental, and emotional pain. Your loved ones should not be dead. The Bible teaches that this is exactly what heaven will be like in Revelation chapter 21 to 22. It's also pretty evident that Adam and Eve took the Garden of Eden, a heaven-like state, for granted. The most controversial planks of this model will be C, D, and E. I've already defended C above. E will be defended later in this video. In order to guarantee that no sin occurs in heaven, it may be that God has to actualize a world in which we experience suffering pre-heaven. In any world feasible for God to actualize, there may not be a world in which everyone freely recognizes the good they've got. Dr. Stratton's primary point is that in order to prevent us from sinning in heaven and introducing evil and suffering there, we'll have to learn what it's like to live in a fallen world. He invites us to imagine one day in which we wake up and everything is perfect. This is a thought experiment that Dr. Tim Stratton brings out in his paper and in his dissertation. He says, imagine one day you wake up, everything is perfect, there's no wars, no pandemics, no bills that need to be paid, your weight problem is gone, your mental disorders are gone, everything is perfect. Now, The way to keep this state of affairs from falling back into the suffering state it was before, all you have to do is obey a few rules. Dr. Stratton asks, would you obey those rules if it meant no one, including yourself, would ever suffer or die again? I don't know about you, but I certainly would keep those rules. I would do everything I could to keep those rules. Well, what rules are we talking about, though? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, strength, and mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. Matthew chapter 22, verses 36 to 40. The two laws that Jesus says all the laws and the prophets hang upon. If you obey those two, you obey the rest. So when we enter into glory and we experience the beauty of an unfallen creation, although we'll retain the ability to sin, God's not going to take away our libertarian free will. Nevertheless, we will always choose not to. Although we could choose to sin, we never would choose to sin. That's an important distinction a lot of people fail to grasp. A lot of people fail to grasp the distinction between could do differently and would do differently. Just because you would never choose to sin in heaven doesn't mean that you're not free. What Stratton is saying is that, having learned from how stupid sin is, we will think about sin and we'll be like, been there, done that, that was not fun. The suffering that comes from sin serves to us like a shot collar to a dog's bark. We won't do it anymore because we'll have learned how awful it is. It's possible that a world in which free creatures always do the right thing and never cause others to suffer is a world that is infeasible for God to create. It's also possible that God may not get people to freely take suffering-free states of affairs for granted without allowing suffering that is the result of natural evil at minimum, and maybe moral evil as well. So it's possible that God could have a good reason even for natural evil.